This is Scott Spratt from ProFootballFocus.com Fantasy, and this is another edition of the Fantasy Slam. News recently broke that the Houston Texans are going to make a quarterback switch coming off of their Week 10 bye. Ryan Mallett will be getting the start over veteran Ryan Fitzpatrick. In deeper leagues and 2 quarterback leads, Fitzpatrick may have been somewhat fantasy relevant, but for the most part, he's been ignored in fantasy, and it's unrealistic to expect Mallett to do much more himself. However, the change could have a profound impact on the skill position players on the Texans, and so it's definitely worth investigating. Mallett was a third-round pick by the Patriots back in 2011. He's a big player at 6'6", 240 pounds, and he has a reputation as having a big arm, but with some accuracy issues. He's only had a handful of passes in the NFL so far, so that's sort of unverified. Fitzpatrick is a known commodity. This season, his 9.0 yard average depth of throw is close to the middle of the pack, but he has just 31 attempts of 20 or more yards down the field. That's about half that of Nick Foles and 2/3 of many of the elite quarterbacks in the league like Phillip Rivers and Ben Roethlisberger. Fitzpatrick is a conservative player, and based on the reputation in his college career, that may not be the case with Mallett. Now, the 2 primary receiving options on the Texans are DeAndre Hopkins and Andre Johnson. Hopkins has been considered to be more of the downfield threat, but even with Fitzpatrick under center, he's been much better than Johnson so far this year. His 92 standard fantasy points makes him the number 12 receiver, although he, of course, hasn't had his Week 10 bye yet. Johnson only has 61 standard points, making him the number 37 receiver in fantasy. Johnson has actually had more targets so far this season, but Hopkins has done more with his, having more than 100 yards more than Johnson and a lot more touchdowns. Johnson has just 1 touchdown so far this season, and that's something that's plagued him throughout his fantasy career. But on the deep throws, Hopkins has really shined. He's called 53.8% of those balls, and that's the second best of 23 qualified receivers, which are receivers with 13 or more deep targets. In contrast, Johnson has only caught 36.4% of those deep targets and has 2 fewer deep targets than Hopkins overall. Hopkins has already been the more useful fantasy receiver, but the switch makes it seem like he may be even better, or rather Johnson may be even worse, relatively speaking. I think Hopkins is a top 20 receiver the rest of this season, but for Johnson, the targets mean you probably have to respect him as a top 30 option, but it's towards the end, and the downside is much greater. For Pro Football Focus, this is Scott Spratt.